me ask you a question. Are you superstitious? To be honest, I'm not. But the last painting I did right before vacation was called The Storm. And I was told before I arrived in Greece that it was a very dry season and it didn't rain for about 4 months. But that soon changed because during my stay, it rained quite a bit and I encountered quite a vicious storm as well. Hello and welcome. My name is Charlambos. I go by Bob and I'm not your typical painter. And today, I'm not going to talk about superstition. I'm going to talk about how I painted the clouds in my painting, The Storm. I was really a fan of this photo right here because there was almost a split with the sky. Because there were some clouds on one side as well as here, and there was some sunlight visible diagonally. But I do want to say that my goal was not to do a realistic painting. It was in a way to do something borderline realism, but with some expressionism. The expressionism of dread. Plus I tried to give myself a deadline. I was trying to complete this painting very quickly and to simplify a lot of the detail. But that didn't mean I threw out every rule of painting. One of the big goals was still to have a sense of shape, form, and volume with the clouds. But I wanted people who looked at it to have a sense of dread as a pending storm was coming. Just like the one I dealt with in Greece this year in the summer. Anyhow, before I go into the demonstration, I want to show the colors I used. I did use, obviously, a lot of white. So titanium white was definitely the main color. But for my darks, I used Viridian and Alizarin Crimson. These two colors get me a nice dark, but when you use more Alizarin Crimson, you get more of a violet tone. As for the blue, I did use cobalt blue, particularly for the sky, and in certain areas, to make some of the darks appear a little more darker and warm, I used a bit of cadmium orange. Speaking of cadmium orange, using titanium white with a tad bit of cadmium orange helps get very extreme brights, and you will see that in the video. So without any further delay, let's get to the underpainting. I began by painting big bodies of color. Nothing too detailed. In a way, I was just working out the composition and trying to figure out where the clouds will be. I used different tones of blue and a titanium white mixed with a tad bit of cadmium orange to establish a sense of definition with the clouds and give them shape and form and a sense of volume, using lights and darks. I did not just focus on the clouds, I also started to lay the groundwork for the background as well. There definitely will be a hill with a pathway, a house on top, and some trees as well. And in the far distance, some mountains and a road that leads to them. Just like the clouds, I'm not being very detailed just yet. I'm just laying out bodies of color so I have an idea where the sky meets the rest of the landscape. While doing the underpainting, I am factoring in that parts of the sky are going to be covered, particularly by trees, a house, and other parts of the landscape. That is why later you will notice that I'm not too detailed in certain sections of the clouds. Just think about it. It just doesn't make sense if they're going to be covered by trees and branches. So now it's time to paint the house on the hill. I'm not going to be very detailed right now, but I do want to lay out where it will be. The focus is to do the clouds first and then the rest of the painting, especially since they are in the background, but having an idea of where the house will be will help me paint the clouds. This also gives me the opportunity to soften the edges of where the roof meets the sky. While painting the roof, I paint the clouds that are around it, taking advantage of the paint being wet to make corrections. Same thing with the mountains in the background, but to a greater extent, especially since they are very far in the distance. Not only do I use very soft edges here, but I also make sure that the mountains are very pale too, using some of the colors I mixed for the clouds to lighten them. The goal is to create a nice sense of depth and distance, and having a foreground that's very sharp in the front and a background that's very soft in the back helps establish that. Once again, I'm trying to take advantage of the paint still being wet, and that is the best way to soften edges and push things into the distance. This also gives you the opportunity to fix things too. Because the paint was still wet, I was able to easily correct the shape of the mountain. Let's speed through this section. All I'm doing is painting the background a little bit that is leading to the sky. I do want to lay out the rest of the composition before I go back into painting the clouds. I'm not trying to be detailed, but just lay out where certain fields and trees
and so on will be.
Now it is time to go more detailed and build onto the underpainting.
Anyway, now back to what you came for, the clouds. Now that I feel more confident that I laid out the groundworks for my composition and in a way finished the underpainting, I go back into painting the clouds. But this time the goal is to detail and refine them. But at the same time, make sure they have a painterly look to them. And most importantly, shape and form. So I start building my lights and darks by applying brush strokes in key areas. I'm definitely trying to follow the photo a little bit, and I'm paying attention to where the sun is hitting the clouds, as well as the extreme darks too. In the beginning stages, I'm just going to focus mostly on the middle tones. And definitely towards the end, I will work on the highlights that are very bright and go back into the darks. But right now, the goal is to use lights and darks to create shape and form. One thing I want to point out is at this stage, I'm laying out more solid bodies of color with thicker paint as well. Remember, the goal of the underpainting is to lay out thin bodies of color and try to get the composition down. And now the goal is to use the underpainting as a guide in a way to create the more refined clouds on top of it. The underpainting at this stage is actually dry, but I am working very quickly to take advantage of the paint being wet for the layer on top. Again, I'm trying to follow the photo to a certain extent in order to lay out the lights and darks side by side in some ways, and then I would use a dry brush in order to smooth some sections, but I tried to keep some sense of roughness though. These clouds do appear to be menacing, and in order to amplify that feeling of dread, some rough brushwork will definitely help. One thing I did try to make sure was clearly visible was a small opening on the top left where you could see a little bit of the blue sky. I definitely tried to paint very carefully around it and enhanced it with some cobalt blue mixed with a tad bit of my dark tone of alizarin crimson and some viridian. Going back to the colors being side by side, depending on how round or how jagged the clouds were, my dry brushing would be different. For the sections that were more smooth and larger, I would dry brush the lights and darks to a nice soft blend, but for the sharper, more defined sections, I barely softened the edges. I pretty much was being very strategic when it came to soft and hard edges, and medium I suppose. Again, I would use the reference photo and would pay attention to the lights and darks, especially the way they transitioned, in order to determine how hard or soft the edges would be, as well as the distance of the transitions. I'm going to speed through this section. What I'm doing is focusing on big bodies of color first, dry brushing here and there to smooth out some of the edges and establish shape and form with the lights and darks. I'm not too focused just yet on the detail, but that is definitely coming up. And once again, I'm trying to take advantage of the paint being wet, so I am working very quickly. Okay, let's slow down for a bit. For most of the painting up until now, I was using larger brushes. But as you can see, now I am starting to use the tiny ones and a canvas stretcher as well to steady my hand, because this is the stage where I am starting to fine-tune things. Besides slowing down the footage, I'm also starting to paint a little slower too, and the brush strokes I am applying are more purposeful. The goal is to really give the clouds a sense of shape and form as well as volume by, in a way, carving out the detail with paint. I'm also using little brushes in order to create definition in the clouds, on a small scale of course, especially some of the smaller bumps and curves. Yes, clouds are soft, but in a way they have visual texture, and that is what I am trying to accomplish by using little brush strokes of lights and darks. If I feel they are too harsh, I would just use a dry brush to gently soften them, especially while the paint is still wet. In order to get the texture, I'm not exactly copying the photo, I'm trying to mimic the pattern I see. The ultimate goal is to give the illusion of little bumps and crevices in the clouds, especially in areas that the sunlight is visible and also closer to the viewer. That is why usually the bottom of the clouds, close to the horizon, tend to be more smooth and have little to no texture. Plus the edges will be softer and not as harsh. This pretty much complements the very detailed parts of the clouds and helps create a sense of depth and distance in the sky, complementing the clouds that are closer and are full of detail. As for the very bright spots, especially the parts of the clouds that are in direct sunlight. I try to include a tad bit of detail, but for the most part, it is almost pure titanium white with a tad bit of cadmium orange. Anyhow, let's speed through this part of the video. It's pretty much more of the same. I'm constantly building up the clouds with lights and darks, following the photo as a reference. And again, I do want to take advantage of the paint being wet, so in a way I am working very quickly. And if I make a mistake here and there with the texture, no worries, I could just soften it a little bit with a dry brush and then paint over it again. In some scenarios, I'm constantly rebuilding sections. I'm pretty much applying brush strokes of particular colors, dry brushing, and then applying more colors, and then dry brushing again. And in some areas the clouds are stringy. I try to follow the photo a little bit, but for the most part, it's just a reference. I just remind myself that the ultimate goal is to give the viewer a sense of dread of a pending storm that's coming. Now time to slow down a bit and emphasize on some of the little details that I have done. Pretty much I'm trying to wrap up the clouds here, and at this stage I am not afraid to go a little thicker with my paint, especially the areas that are more on the bright side. Those thick applications of paint pretty much stand out to the viewer, especially since it's not just visible texture, it's physical as well. This is definitely something you want to save towards the end. It is a nice little trick that helps make certain parts of the clouds stand out, especially the parts that are in direct sunlight and closer to the viewer. Also, do not be afraid to repaint parts of the sky. Most of my composition is full of dreaded clouds, but there are a few visible parts of the sky. I definitely go back into them just to make sure those openings are very distinguishable. In a way, I created a blue outline of where the clouds meet the sky, and also in a way painted a few visible cracks of blue, and then I dry brushed accordingly. But I do pay special attention to the sections that have direct sunlight. Besides adding a blue outline where the sky is, I apply some very thick titanium white with some cadmium orange. Plus, I do not soften the edge too much of where the sun is. I leave it a tad bit sharper. The goal is for the sunlight to stand out, which is the reverse for the parts of the clouds that are not in direct sunlight. I definitely soften those edges a little bit more. Now time to paint the right side of the painting. For the most part, the left side had a lot more intricate detail, thanks to more of the visible sunlight. But for sure, the clouds on the other side definitely had more dark tones. But that didn't mean that they lacked definition. I still paid attention to the photo in order to sculpt the clouds with light and dark tones. But definitely they were more subtle. Let's speed through this section. I want to go to the clouds that are more in the distance that are on the bottom. Now here are a batch of clouds that are at the very bottom. They are definitely more into the distance than anything else in the painting. Plus they are above the mountains as well. And just like the top left of the painting, there's parts of the sky that is visible too. But unlike the top left, the blue is definitely going to be more paler, especially since it's in the bottom part of the horizon. The blue of a sky usually gradually gets lighter and lighter, almost disappearing completely into a warm white. Also, because this section is more into the distance, I will use softer edges for where the sky meets the clouds. I am pretty much using the same technique again, where I'm laying out bodies of color, this time on a smaller scale, and then dry brushing away. I'm also detailing some of those clouds in the distance. They appear to be a few clusters. Yes, my brushwork is rough, but I do use a dry brush to soften them. Once again, I'm going to speed through this section too. Pretty much more of the same. I'm also taking the opportunity right now to paint the rest of the skyline and the mountains too. The clouds in the distance are so heavy, it almost appears as a heavy mist engulfs the background. Besides doing wet on wet, I also did wet on dry to soften some edges. I pretty much spread with a brush wet paint thinly over dry paint, particularly for some of the mountains and the background. Now it's time to slow down again. After standing back from my painting, I felt like I needed to apply more darks. So once again, I used my alizarin crimson and viridian mixture with some cobalt blue as well as a tad bit of cadmium orange. The paint is still wet, so it was very easy to apply right into the sky and then dry brush away. I want to point out that not always is the dry brushing to smooth things, sometimes it's to be directional. Pretty much it's to move the paint around and create the swirls of the clouds. But I didn't just focus on darks, I was also focusing on the lights and middle tones as well. Whatever was necessary to give the clouds shape and form. Anyways, let's speed up again to another section, or should I say challenge. But since I had the bulk of the sky done, now it was time to paint the rest of the painting, at least before I add the final touches. There was the house that needed some work, the rest of the hill, the landscape in the distance, and of course the trees, which in a way overlapped the sky. I waited for the paint to be a little bit dry before I did the trees. I always kept in mind that if I made mistakes with the trees or the branches, I can in a way erase them by using the color of the sky. Or the clouds that are nearby, that is. One of the things I was really considering dropping from the photo was the power line, but there was something that made me keep them, including a tower nearby that held the wires together. This was actually quite challenging to do because I had to paint straight lines, or should I say slightly curvy ones, since they do sag a bit from pole to pole. But luckily for me, they were in the distance. That meant that they did not have to be sharp and in a way blurry. So in a way I just jotted down some paint to form the lines, and in a way I used a dry brush to smooth them out. This was in a way wet on dry, so the smoothing out process kinda erased the lines a bit, especially the rough edges. But I was not too worried about the imperfections. I knew later I would just come back and just repaint parts of the sky, especially between the wires and some of their rough edges. I did try to make sure that they did not have too sharp of an appearance. Since they are kinda in the distance, I do want them to recede a bit.
If you made it to the end, thanks for watching. I truly appreciate it, and hopefully you found this video helpful. I came back from my trip recently and I took lots and lots of photos, so stay tuned for some new paintings. For more of my work, check out my Instagram, not your typical painter of course, or my Etsy shop. Anyhow, thanks for watching. Bye for now.